Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. For those of you who are not familiar with us, we are Digital Glue, and we're a systems integrator. We have offices in California as well as in Atlanta, and basically we're a glass-to-glass systems integrator. So that's from the glass of the lens to the glass of your screen. So my name is Nick Anderson. I'm the presenter. I'm basically in charge of kind of all things post-production we do here at Digital Glue, and that extends from the camera all the way through into post. And I also do freelance work as well as a colorist, DIT, and post specialist. So as a DIT, I have a lot of experience on set, basically helping people on set understand how is what's in front of the camera going to be captured down in data. How can they work with that later? Because it's not always easy to see when you're on set. Okay, what can I do with this? So that's what I do on set. So we are your one technology partner for content creation, post-production, contribution, and distribution. So basically, whatever your technology needs are related to media, post-production, all of that, we've got you covered. So as a systems integrator, basically what we do is work with you to figure out what you need, get it for you, put it all together, install it, make sure it all works, teach you how to use it, and then we support you as you go. It's that simple. So this specific webinar is the second in our series, Navigating the Chaos. The first part was about how to build a studio, and this part is about choosing the right camera for you. So the first thing we're going to go over is sensor technology. Then we're going to go into the differences between raw versus baked video. Then we'll talk about image dimensions, the size of your sensor, and how kind of the image all works and how you capture it. Then we'll talk about optics and light. Then I'll go into color spaces. And we'll talk about the form factor of cameras. Then we'll talk about all the technical stuff that is always a nightmare to go into. And then uh, the big takeaway is going to be, how do you master your tool so you can focus on the creative process? So you probably, banging your head against the wall sometimes when you're thinking, okay, wait, how do cameras even work, right? Have you been too afraid to ask? Because, this is something that you can kind of get through with all the buzzwords and, okay, it works and figuring it all out, but there is real science underneath it all that, there's actually an objective thing that's happening that you need to understand to really be able to understand the whole process, right? So the good news is the truth is out there. And it is actually pretty simple when you're able to get down to the nitty gritty and figure it out. So really, at the end of the day, light is measured 1 pixel at a time, right? So you just have a sensor and you've got pixels on there. And so this basically what we're going to go over in part 1 is how cameras actually work. Right? Because it's simple, right? You either have a prism or you have a Bayer pattern. It's obvious, right? No, you don't understand yet? Okay. So yeah, you've got prism or Bayer. And it's really all about asking the right question, which is, how does a camera capture light as data, right? Or really the question is, how does video even work? Right, how does a camera see? Right, well, video, the word video is literally the Latin word for to see, right? So how does a camera see? Well, the answer is image sensors, right? So an image sensor is a measurement device that's used to capture light as data, right? So remember these guys, Prism and Bayer? Well, they tie in very closely to the different kinds of sensor technology that we have. So at the beginning, we had 3CCD, right? So a 3CCD sensor was actually 3 sensors, and you had a light prism that would take in the full spectrum color light, and split it into 3 individual light beams, right? A red, green, and a blue light beam that actually went to individual sensors. So you had one sensor per color channel, and every single pixel in that final image actually had a red, green, and a blue value. But that's not the kind of technology we use today. We actually use CMOS sensors, where each pixel only has one color value. So it's a red, green, or blue pixel. And that's what we're going to go into with the Bayer pattern. So really, not all pixels are created equal. And you're maybe thinking, I thought CMOS sensors were the best, right? Isn't that what cinema cameras use? Don't Red cameras and ARRI cameras and basically every single camera manufacturer use CMOS sensors? What's this 3CCD sensor thing you're talking about? Well, yes, CMOS sensors are what everyone uses because CCD is expensive. And actually, our vision is pretty limited. Human vision actually has some limitations that these manufacturers actually understand. And so what they do is they just make the pixels really tiny so that we don't really have to notice the difference, and computers are actually really good at guessing. So yeah, I still haven't gotten to what the bear is, so that's what we're going to go into now. Right, so Bayer was actually a person who came up with a pattern and a filter. So you may think that sensors actually understand color, but the reality is that each pixel on there is really just a gray pixel. It can just understand the light value, and you had to filter out all the other color channels in order to get the one isolated value to that pixel on the actual sensor to understand it, right? So you have one channel per pixel, red, green, or blue. And what the Bayer pattern actually does is it layers blue, green, as you can see on this top row, and then green, red, green, red. And so you actually have twice as many green as blue pixels. And the reason for that is because the green channel, for some reason, actually includes more detail than any other channel. So it's better to have more of those. And so Bryce Bear, who was actually an employee for Kodak, who invented this, um, he even said that basically what they're doing is they're getting more information out of what they have. They're getting more information on luminance, which is basically brightness, light value, and less information on the chrominance, which is the color value, right? So what they're actually doing is with the limitations of the sensor, they're optimizing quality by sacrificing the one-to-one color accuracy. So you can see the way that it's laying it out here. You've got the pattern that you have here on the left, the Bayer pattern, and you have red, green, green, blue, and then you split those out. That's what the color filter array is, basically splitting those out into their individual colors, and then you're interpolating the other values, right? So it's basically guessing from the ones nearby what this value is. Now the brightness is correct on every pixel, but the color values are grabbed from the nearby pixels, right? And that's how video works pretty much everywhere now. I mean, even on your phone, that's how you're getting the image. So what's the takeaway from this section? Well, it's really all about finding the best compromise, right? I mean, 3CCD is the best you can get in terms of one-for-one quality, but the reality is we don't need to get to that standard. That CMOS sensors actually are really good, come a long way since they started over a decade ago, and this whole entire thing is really about finding the right compromise for you and then learning how to work with that data. So why did I go over all this if you're not going to be looking at CCD sensors? Well, the point is that all of it is about finding a compromise. There is no best camera, there's no right camera. It's about finding the one that works for you. And then once you've made that decision, forgetting about all the other ones and really getting into the nuances of how your specific camera works, because they all work very differently in terms of the underlying data, the color, and all that, which we'll go into. So it's really about turning the data into something that looks cinema real. And that's the real challenge, right? So why cinema reel? Because VFX supervisor Rob Legato, when he was working on the Jungle Book, they started finding that they were making these animals out in Africa and the jungle, and it wasn't enough just to have it be accurate, to actually have it look real. What they needed to do is make it look cinema real. They need to set up the lighting, they need to set up all the things that we are used to as an audience seeing in order to engage us emotionally. So how image data is stored is important, right? You've got raw video and you've got baked video. So the raw video is straight from the sensor, and baked video is processed in some way, right? You're taking those ingredients and you're turning it into something, right? So raw is like your digital negative. So back in the film days, you shot on a negative, and that negative could be exposed into multiple different positive images, right? So in the same way with digital, when you're shooting a digital image, you are actually getting a direct readout of the sensor data, right? And so that, using that Bayer pattern, has to be debayered back to play back, right? So that, pattern of the greens, the reds, and the blues, you create the new pixels and you're able to play it back like that. Before that, it would look ridiculous. You wouldn't be able to actually notice an image on it at all. It's not visible. But what that does is it gives you more control over the image afterwards. So all the settings that you're setting up in your camera, those affect the image that you're seeing, but they don't necessarily change the underlying raw data. But when you get to a baked image, right, that's like that digital positive. Um, so with film, you actually expose it, you got to a positive, which was a specific image, and you wouldn't be able to manipulate that as much because it was actually that image. You made a lot of decisions, you'd taken those ingredients and you actually baked them into something. So each pixel here has a full red, green, and blue value, right? So it's a full light value. And it takes more data to store it because you actually have everything defined. Whereas with raw, you're just having the actual data behind it. It doesn't actually mean how it's going to look. And then the camera settings are actually baked into the image, so you can't really change as much. You can't make decisions afterwards, which is tricky. So the difference really in terms of a practical workflow is that with RAW, you're going to get higher quality, right? Which means you're also going to have more freedom to make decisions. You can choose, your ISO, your exposure. You can change the color space around. There's a lot of freedom you have to make decisions, but you have to have the skill and knowledge to actually make those decisions. Whereas if you use a baked workflow, you're going to get some more speed because you have less control. You have to make less decisions, and it's a simpler workflow overall to understand because what you see is what you get. So why is color so hard to get right? Well, it's because we have proprietary color spaces. Each manufacturer actually has to calibrate the color space for their specific sensor to get the data in properly and into some kind of objective standard that they can use to get into other things. So I don't want to go too far into the stuff because this is a whole other can of worms we have to go into, but let's pop the lid off a little bit, right? Because what is a color space? A color space is a color gamma and a color gamut, right? And really all you need to know about that is that this is how the raw sensor data is mapped to displays. So you have scene referred and display referred color spaces, right? And that's really how you get from glass to glass, being the glass of your camera to the glass of your final display, right? So you're bending light from reality to your screen. So with a scene referred color space, it's just like raw video, right? It's exactly the values that your sensor captured. And that's pure RGB data. And pure meaning it's actually the way the light hit the sensor, and that's the readout. And that really can't be displayed properly. You have to conform that into something. So you take that scene referred color space and you map it into a display referred color space. And so your values are really tailored to the display that you're going to use. And so, in the computer, what that value is not as relevant as the way it actually looks on the display. That's why we use calibrators in order to actually calibrate the display to a standard as close as we can. And so the data from the scene referred data is conformed to match the display because all displays have different um, specifications on what they can handle in terms of dynamic range and color. There's a lot of factors in there. So everything has to be tailored to the display. So that's why when you have a production, you typically will go out with um, a separate master for theatrical versus Blu-ray versus television versus all these different things because the color is treated differently. All right, guys. Sorry, my headset ended up not working. Okay, so we'll go through this again. So yeah, so now we're in part two. So this is it's what's on the outside. Okay. So when it comes to sensors, size actually matters. And what you need to consider is field of view and spatial distortion, right? You want to get the image that's in front of you onto the sensor. And as you can see here in this background image, you've got different sensor sizes, right? And that obviously cuts off what you're actually seeing. So your sensor defines your field of view, which is actually the area that you can actually capture your image down to. So you've got the aspect ratio, which is the ratio of width to height. And then you have the crop factor, which is what you saw in that previous image, which is actually the subsection of the sensor that you use for capture. And what you want to do basically is choose your lenses so that you can control how space is distorted to get into that field of view, right? So if you use a spherical lens, it's just going to take the image, bring it in, put it on the sensor. Whereas an anamorphic lens will actually compress the details outside, so you actually get more field of view onto your smaller sensor. And then later on, you actually expand that to get that field of view in the final image. And the same way you have coverage on your lens basically is covering, is how much of the image sensor that the lens can actually cover. So if you have, let's say, a full frame sensor, you don't want to use a lens that's designed for micro four thirds because you literally will crop out the edges of the lens. And really what the most important thing is to understand equivalent field of view. So if you understand your crop factor, now you can calculate the difference between the lens and what you're actually going to get between different sensor sizes. And that's all, a little confusing. So this is really the most important thing to understand about it, is that your sensor and your lens choice is about optics and whether you want shallow or deep focus, because your focal length is consistent as your field of view changes. So a smaller sensor is going to more easily give you shallower depth of field, whereas a bigger sensor is going to easily give you deeper depth of field. So what's the takeaway? Sensor size and lens choice are what make your image aesthetics. And this is really the difference that we feel between different types of productions, right? I mean, indie productions used to have this, in film days, used to have a specific aesthetic, and that a lot of that was actually based on having a smaller film gate and using specific lenses that gave you that style. Same thing goes for 35 millimeter, and that's the standard cinema look that we're used to. And then you have, let's say, something like The Revenant, looks huge and cinematic in a very different way, and that's because of the 65 millimeter huge form factor. So really, when you're looking at creatively, this choice here is what is a big part of the way your final film is going to look. So we've talked about all the ingredients, except you. Right, so form factor matters because you're actually going to have to use this camera. So there's the running gun form factor, where you can have a single operator. Typically, it's either in your hands or over the shoulder, but it's light enough to use for long periods of time. And you use smaller lenses, like photo style ones, because you don't want to have all that, junk on your camera that you have to then hold and balance all the time. On the other hand, you have studio form factors for cameras, which really are designed to have a camera department, camera. It's designed to be put on sticks or stabilizer, and the lenses can be designed differently because you don't have to worry about the size as much. You can actually get all of the parts specifically designed to get you the image you want. So the lines are a little blurred when it comes to how cameras are priced, but for the most part, you actually find that pricing is split up by the form factor. So capture quality is not always directly correlated to this form factor, and that's why you can make some interesting decisions on your cameras, because their smaller cameras actually have higher features than larger cameras. So the entry level is the DSLR or mirrorless form factor. We used to have DSLRs, and in recent years, mirrorless has really overtaken the market. These DSLR form factor cameras are compact, they're easy to use, but they weren't designed for video. And so some of them have overheating problems when you shoot too long, and overall, they don't necessarily have as much processing power internally. So with the exception of the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera 4K, most of these do not have RAW, usually an external recorder to shoot with them in these higher quality formats, or you use compressed formats in camera. Then we have the ENG form factor, which was designed for news gathering. And that's the typical over-the-shoulder form factor, which is designed for a single operator and usually has cheaper parts, more plastic build than metal, and that's really just to lower the price. And then finally, there's the cinema form factor, which are the larger cameras, look a little more boxy, basically a computer with a sensor slapped on it, and have all these accessories you add on to customize the camera the way you want it to work. And they have the highest image quality. There's usually additional features and higher quality filters and all kinds of things they put into these cameras to give you that better quality. And unfortunately, for the most part, the color scientists figured out for these cameras and then ported it down to the lower quality cameras. So while on paper you may have the same features, there's actually some internal parts that mean that the color science is actually less accurate on the lower end cameras. But the biggest thing is that you end up with these large file sizes when you use these cameras that you then have to manage through the process. And overall, these are designed for a crew. So what's the takeaway from this? Well, you actually need to have your camera able to go with you where you need to shoot in order to use it. So it's about balancing quality and usability, because a camera is worthless if you can't use it. So now let's go into all the ones and zeros, the digital, all this technology stuff. I'm going to try to keep it light just so that you understand what you need to consider. Because at the end of the day, all you have is data, right? I mean, that's what goes on beyond the production, right? And it's really about figuring out what workflows can you support, right? What workflows can your storage and compute resources support? Because that's really where you get all the trade-offs, right? Your capture format has financial and practical impacts down the chain. You need to know if your storage is fast enough, because really you need real-time playback to make creative decisions, right? Because it's all about timing. I mean, so much of creating good content is about timing and pacing. And if you give your team cheap, slow drives just because they can fit the data, they're not going to be able to make those decisions. And you need to make sure that your workstation can actually handle the formats, because every video format utilizes hardware differently. Some use CPU, some use GPU, and you shouldn't expect just because the camera is cheap that your cheap laptop will actually be able to support playback of that footage. And what people do when they can't actually support the source format playing back in real time on their storage or their workstation is they go through a proxy workflow, which basically means you take the media and you convert it into a proxy format, which basically means a format that stands in the place of your source media for workflow purposes. So you're just converting your footage into a lower quality file that your computer can handle, and then you have to relink it at the end of the source before you do your final export. Because if you are trying to do a budget production and you end up compromising on your budget, then you'll end up paying for that probably later on with the complexity in managing all this stuff. And you don't want to get bit in the ass later on with all these technical issues and having to deal with them in crunch time. So how does digital video work? Well, you have frames of pixels. And really those frames of pixels are color values at certain coordinates that are there to tell a display what to display and when, right? What color value and brightness should I light up each of these pixels on your monitor is really all it is. Instructions to a display. So the easiest video compression to handle is no compression, except for it's not easy for your storage to handle it because it's huge, and it's very demanding on your workstation because you have a huge amount of data you have to push through your pipe. But every bit is present and accounted for. Whereas with lossless compression, the computer basically looks at the data as if it's a puzzle. And if it can take some of those pieces out and describe them in different ways, then it can get to the same end image, but it doesn't actually have to store that whole data. So you save on your storage, but then you spend on your workstation because your computer has to reconstruct the same image from all that data, right? So you're still having to display to every single pixel the right value. You just aren't one for one actually putting that into the data the way it's going to go. Then we have light compression, which isn't light as in like a light bulb, light as in not a lot. And this is, like ProRes, Cineform, DNX. These are formats that you spend more on storage depending on what your workflow is. But you save on the workstation because it's already there in a format that the workstation can handle. It doesn't have to do a lot of processing. And so these are typically referred to as intermediate formats because these are the ones that your computer likes working with. And they actually are pretty high quality. So if you're looking at baked media, this is pretty much the kind of media you're going to be making. It's lightly compressed, high enough quality that you can go out with it. If you convert into it and you lose the source media, a lot of time you're okay. And then finally, we have lossy compression, which really only exists because camera manufacturers of stills cameras like Canon with the 5D Mark II figured out how they could do video and not overheat their sensors for the first time. And so they put in the only video format that could actually work within the internals on their cameras, which was H.264, but that format was designed specifically for final delivery. So it really has almost no color information other than the image that you see. And so when you go to work with it, it falls apart really quick. So if you, let's say, have a GoPro and you're shooting H.264 and you're wondering, why is my cheap camera destroying my workstation? Well, it's because every single image is being constructed by your computer. It's putting all of the work on your computer in order to have almost no file size. So when I said with light compression, you're using more storage. If you're shooting in these formats and you have to convert to an intermediate format in order to work with it, now you're going to have a lot more data because your data is going to be more realistically allocated. So how do I choose between all these formats, right? It's really not black and white. You have to do the math to figure out your bandwidth requirements and what your workstation can handle, and really just test. There's lots of clips you can find online from all these different cameras. You can download those and you can actually run the calculations yourself and do actual performance testing. So what's the takeaway? Well, you really need to plan out your entire workflow, right? Because you don't want to discover bottlenecks until it's too late. It can be really easy during the budget phase to just make a bunch of decisions and go, okay, this is going to work, and then you end up finding too late and you haven't budgeted enough in your schedule to actually figure all this stuff out. So now part 4, the conclusion and a little bit of a shameless plug. You're thinking, okay, I sat through all this, just tell me what camera to buy. Well, unfortunately, the question is, what are you shooting? Because, I actually did try to figure out, okay, how can I narrow this down to pick this camera, pick that camera, and, have kind of a turnkey bundle. But the problem is with it is that there are so many factors, both practically and technically, that go into making a camera choice. For you specifically, maybe having an optical stabilizer is the most important thing to you because you're running around all the time and you don't have, a rig that you can carry and that kind of stuff. So maybe optical stabilization is the most important feature to you. Likewise, maybe battery life is the most important. And you could actually sacrifice on image quality as long as your camera keeps shooting because you're going out to festivals or something and you need to be out all day. There's so many different shooting styles that you can do. The most important thing is to just figure out what do you actually need to do with the camera and work back from that. And I hope I've given you, the things you need to think about in that process. That's really, I hope this was a primer for you to actually start this process of thinking through these things, right? And the first takeaway is, stick with the science. It may seem like cameras are magic. You've got, megapixels and megabytes and all these things that are trying to say, pick me in terms of your cameras, but really there is an actual technology underneath. And for the most part, cameras are pretty dang good these days.
So for the most part, you're not going to end up with a horrible image as long as you know how to work with that image, right? Because what you see isn't always what you get. And so you need to understand how to work with the data that your specific camera captures, right? You need to understand, how does the sensor actually capture data? How does the exposure work? It's really important to understand how some cameras actually want you to overexpose or underexpose in order to get the data where it needs to be, because you really have this, limited range of data you can capture, and you have to learn how to use that range as best as possible to give yourself as much freedom later on to work with it. Or on the other hand, if you don't have the time to work with it, you need to figure out, how can I get my camera on set to work as well as possible to make the final image. And then you got to remember that artistic choices are equally as important as these technical choices, right? Choosing your sensor and your lens really has as much an aesthetic, impact on your final image as your color and your sound and all the different elements that go together into it. And then you got to make sure that you actually think of the physical implications of the camera, right? You're actually going to have this on your shoulder or in your hands or on a rig or whatever it is. You're going to have to physically deal with this camera as you're using it, and that's something you can't forget. And then finally, you got to think through the whole workflow, because you really don't want to be caught later on guessing. And you can do camera tests ahead of time. There's lots of rental houses that will allow you to come in, test the gear, and get some test clips, and you can run it through the whole process. I mean, that's really what most productions do, is they actually do this ahead of time, and they figure out all this stuff before they go in, so everything's fleshed out and there is no question. So what have we covered? Well, we've covered sensor technology with the CCD and CMOS sensor, how Bayer patterns and pixels work. We went into raw versus baked video, went into image dimensions, the size of your sensor with field of view and the optics and how all that comes together. We talked about color spaces a little bit, talked about the form factor, picking the right form factor for you. We went through storage and compute and all the technical requirements with that. And finally, really, the takeaway is, once you pick your camera, right, just master it, figure out all the technical stuff, and then you can finally focus on the creative, which is really the important thing. With all of this, it's really about figuring out your tools, becoming a master of it, so that you can get back to thinking what's important, which is the creative element of everything. And so here's the shameless plug. As digital glue or systems integrator, our job is to focus on the technology so that we can help you focus on creative. Every time that you're distracted by these technical hurdles, your mindset moves away from the creative, and it's harder to get back into that flow that you need to create content, right? So, we can be your help to get to that light at the end of the tunnel. You don't need to know all the technical stuff, right? You need to tell us what you creatively want to do, and we'll focus on building the stairs so that you can get up there and start creating. So to help creatives stay creative, we actually created creative.space, right? With the mission to minimize the time it takes to turn vision into reality. And what is creative.space? It's managed storage for creatives, right? So it's shared storage, high speed, fast enough for whether it's uncompressed or compressed or all the different formats. We scaled the system to your workflow, and it allows you to collaborate with your whole team in real time instead of juggling a bunch of hard drives. We provide proactive support as a technology partner, not just a cleanup crew. So all these questions, whether it's what camera you should get, or how the formats are going to work through your whole workflow, all of that has an impact on storage. Storage is really the heart of the workflow. So with creative.space, you basically get a technology partner to help you with all that stuff. And you also get our intuitive software that you can be an early adopter on and basically help shape the course of where we're going to go with it. And really, the software is designed to make your day-to-day life easier when you're working with storage. And all of this comes with a monthly service. So you get the hardware, software, and support for a fixed monthly payment on plans going from 1, 2, 3, or even 5 years. And why do you need the storage? Well, it's so that you can collaborate, right? It's all about collaboration and achieving creative flow across your entire team, because every single interruption can have an exponential effect on how much you can get done. And really what we want to do is give you back more time to be creative. So if you want to reach out and talk to us, we have an office in Atlanta, and one sec. Okay, yeah. Go to our office in Atlanta. You can also call us at 404-900-6799. You can email us at info@creative.space. Go to our website, digitalglue.com or creative.space. We also have our headquarters in Southern California. Thank you for joining us for this webinar.